My brother sat across from me with his back perfectly straight, hands folded on the mahogany table. Behind him, my Aunt Caroline watched with her jaw tight. My cousin Raymond pretended to examine his phone. My mother stood by the window, her face angled away. They knew. "I wanted to talk about Dad's estate," Matthew began, his voice rehearsed and calm. "And what's fair for everyone." He placed the documents in front of me. The papers were thick with legal language designed to confuse. I scanned the first page and felt something cold slide down my spine. Words like reasonable management, family consensus, and long-term security jumped out at me, intentionally vague. "I need time to read these," I said quietly. "Of course," he said. "We all think this is the right move." Well, that's when I understood. This wasn't a discussion. This was an execution. Everyone had already decided my role before I walked through the door. I held the documents against my chest and nodded. My hands didn't shake. Not yet. Once they left, no one checked on me. The silence was intentional. It was designed to isolate me, to make me sit alone with these papers long enough that I'd convince myself to sign them just to end the discomfort. That night, I reread the documents. My eyes caught on the same phrases repeatedly. Subject to family consensus. Management decisions require approval. Control reverts to designated administrator. That was Matthew. But there was something else. A clause buried on page 7. It restricted my access to something specific. Something tied to a promise. Our father's promise. I closed my eyes and remembered. 5 years ago, Dad was sick in the hospital bed. His hand thin in mine. Matthew was outside getting coffee. Caroline and my Uncle Michael stood by the window. Dad looked directly at me and said, "The house on Clearwater is yours. I want you to have security. That's where you rebuild." Caroline and Michael both heard it. Both witnessed it. But that house wasn't mentioned anywhere in these documents. I grabbed my phone and found an old email from Matthew sent 3 years ago. Dad wanted me to manage Clearwater for a while. But he never gave it back. I wrote down everything I remembered, date by date. My hand shook as I wrote, but my mind was shifting into something colder, something focused. The promise was specific. Our father had emphasized each word. "The house on Clearwater is yours. For you. For security." Dad died 14 months later. Matthew took charge of everything, the will, the estate, the accounts. No one questioned him. He was the oldest. He was calm and capable, and everyone trusted him. I trusted him. By the time I thought to ask about Clearwater, Matthew had already leased it. He said it was temporary. He said we needed the income. I was grieving. I didn't fight him. That was my mistake. I found an old voicemail from Dad months before he died, where his weak voice talked about making sure I was taken care of. His intention was crystal clear. I saved it to my computer. Then I texted Caroline. "Do you remember what Dad said about Clearwater? About it being mine?" Waited. Minutes passed. Finally. Yes. He was very clear about that. Just 6 words. But they were everything. Caroline had confirmed that the memory was real. As I sat alone with these betrayal papers, I realized something crucial. Matthew didn't know about that voicemail. He didn't know that Caroline remembered so clearly. He didn't know that he'd already made his first mistake. He thought he was the only one who remembered what our father wanted. He was wrong. The next week was orchestrated like a symphony. Monday, Caroline called. "I think signing is the best option for everyone. It simplifies things." Tuesday, Uncle Michael texted, "Your brother really has the family's best interests at heart." Wednesday, Raymond showed up at my work with coffee. "Make sure you're okay with everything. Matthew wouldn't do anything wrong." Thursday, my mother texted, "We're all worried about you. Please don't make this harder." Every message, every phrase. They were repeating Matthew's exact words. Fair for everyone. Best interests. The responsible choice. It wasn't coincidence. It was coordination. I started a document titled Timeline and logged everything. Who said what? When they said it. The exact words. By Friday I had 7 entries. These people hadn't just decided to support Matthew. They'd been told what to say. Matthew had done this before. He knew how to build a wall of consensus around himself. He knew how to make isolation feel like community support. He was a predator who'd learned his craft. And I was documenting every move. Matthew cornered me at our mother's house on Saturday evening. Everyone else had been strategically excused. It was just Matthew and me in the kitchen. "I want to talk about those papers," he said softly. His voice was gentle in a way that made my skin crawl. "I'm still reading them," I said. "I know. But I want you to understand what's really at stake here. For the family." I didn't say anything. Let him fill the silence. If this doesn't go smoothly, people get hurt. Mom gets stressed. The family falls apart. And you'll be the one they blame. The one who couldn't be reasonable. My chest tightened. "I don't want that for you," he said, and he sounded like he meant it. "I want you to be seen as the reasonable one." It was a threat wrapped in concern. Manipulation dressed up as love. "I'll think about it," I said. After he left, I sat in the kitchen for an hour and didn't move. I wasn't afraid. What I felt was something colder. Something more dangerous. I was patient now. And patience was going to be my weapon. I printed out the documents and spread them across my dining table like a crime scene. With a highlighter, I marked every inconsistency, every vague phrase, every place where language seemed designed to obscure rather than clarify. Page 3 had a date that didn't match page 5. The timeline for when I'd supposedly agreed to certain terms was placed before I'd ever actually seen the documents. It was a backdated authorization, proof that someone had written this assuming I would cooperate. Page 9 referenced a previous agreement that didn't exist. Page 12 had a clause about management fees that would siphon money away from my account every quarter. The fees weren't specified. Someone had rushed this. Someone had written it assuming I wouldn't read carefully. Matthew had underestimated me. I created a document titled Inconsistencies and listed 18 separate problems. Next to each one I added what it meant. By the time I finished, I had 18 proofs that this wasn't legitimate. I grabbed my laptop and started searching. Property tax records, rental listings, bank statements I could access online. The math was becoming very clear. Matthew hadn't just tried to trap me with these documents. He'd already been stealing from me for 3 years. I went back through every text message, every email, every family group chat dating back to when our father died. The pattern was so clear it felt obvious in hindsight. 3 years ago Matthew sent me, temporarily leasing Clearwater to help with expenses. I'd agreed without thinking. I was grieving. 2 years ago. The rental income is less than expected. I'll have to keep leasing it longer. 1 year ago, Caroline asked, "Are you happy with how Matthew's managing the Clearwater situation?" It was such an odd question that I'd said yes because I didn't want to seem ungrateful. That wasn't casual. That was Caroline testing to see if I was aware. I found an old email from Matthew to Caroline. "She's not paying attention. It's fine. I can handle this. She's not paying attention." He'd been planning this long before those documents appeared on the table. He'd been lying by omission for 3 years, saying things that were technically true but strategically incomplete. The betrayal wasn't new. It had been happening the entire time. I was just finally seeing it. I decided to become what Matthew wanted me to be. Uncertain, grateful, emotionally fragile. When he called, I answered sounding tired. "I've been thinking about what you said. About the documents." "Yeah." His voice lifted. I could hear him relax. "I think you're right. I just need to understand it better. Can you explain what you're trying to do?" He spent 45 minutes walking me through the documents. And as he talked, something crucial happened. He started revealing things. Details that contradicted what he'd written. explanations that didn't match the language. He said the management fees wouldn't be much, but the documents didn't specify an amount. He said Clearwater would eventually be returned to me, but there was no timeline. He said the family consensus was important, but then admitted he hadn't asked everyone. I wanted to present it as a united front. That way it would seem like we all agreed. He was bragging. He thought I was weak enough to not realize how damaging this confession was. I kept my voice soft and uncertain. Thank you for explaining. I think I needed to hear it from you. After we hung up, I immediately typed out everything he'd said, word for word. Everything that contradicted the documents. He just handed me a confession. I called Caroline on a Tuesday afternoon. I need to ask you something and I need you to be honest. When Dad was in the hospital, he talked about Clearwater. About it being mine. You were there. You heard him. Long pause. Yes, she said finally. He was very clear about that. And Matthew knows that. He had to know. Yes. Told him. When your father died, I made sure Matthew knew what Dad wanted. So when he told me the house was just temporary. He was lying. Caroline finished quietly. I could hear the fear in her voice. She was afraid of what this admission meant. Afraid of choosing between loyalty to me and loyalty to Matthew. I'm not asking you to do anything, I said gently. I just needed you to confirm that I wasn't going crazy. It's real, she said. It's completely real. Caroline had just become my first real witness. Not because I'd forced her, but because I'd asked her to remember what was true. I called Matthew and said I needed more time. That it was too much to process emotionally. How much more time? He asked, and I could hear impatience creeping into his voice. A few weeks. Is that okay? He said it was, but I felt his frustration through the phone. He'd expected this to be done in days. He'd built a timeline where I capitulated quickly, signed the documents, and everything moved forward according to his plan. But I wasn't capitulating. I was stalling. Every day I stalled was a day for him to get nervous. A day for him to start making mistakes. 2 weeks passed. During that time I requested small clarifications. Can you explain what reasonable management means? What's the average quarterly fee? How often would management decisions be reviewed? Each question seemed innocent. Each one made Matthew slightly more frustrated. You're overthinking this, he said during one call. I just want to understand, I replied quietly. He called a family meeting to discuss timeline. That's when I saw it, the crack in his composure. He was no longer patient. His calm had shifted into controlled irritation. He wanted this done. And in his desire to hurry me along, he became careless. During that meeting, he made a statement that directly contradicted something he'd said 2 weeks earlier. My mother noticed. My aunt noticed. I said nothing, but I saw their eyes flick toward each other. For the first time, they were starting to wonder if Matthew was telling the truth. At a family gathering 3 weeks later, Matthew told the story again. This time it was different. The first version was that he wanted to simplify management and protect the family assets. He'd made it sound like a favor to me. But this version, the one he was telling my mother and aunt, was that he was helping to organize things for everyone's benefit, and that I'd expressed concern about managing things myself. I'd expressed no such concern. I'd never said I couldn't handle my own finances. The lie was small, but it was a lie. I watched my mother's face change. Just slightly. Just a shift that said, that's not what she said to me. Actually, my mother said carefully. She seemed pretty confident about managing things when we talked. Matthew smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. She might have said that to you, but she was worried when we spoke privately. My mother didn't argue. But she didn't agree either. And that silence was louder than any confrontation. I realized that no one had told my Uncle Michael directly about the documents. Michael was our father's closest friend. He'd been there when Dad made the promise about Clearwater. But he wasn't at the family meetings. He wasn't part of the coordinated messaging campaign. I reached out to him. Do you remember when Dad was sick? When he talked about the house on Clearwater? Yes, I do. He was very specific about that. Did Matthew ever talk to you about it? No, Michael said, and I heard confusion in his voice. He never did. Why? I'm trying to understand what happened with the house. Matthew's been leasing it, and I wanted to make sure that was intended. Michael's voice changed, became alert. He's been leasing it for how long? 3 years. Since Dad died. And you agreed to that. I thought it was temporary. There was silence on the phone for a long time. Then Michael said quietly, your father would not have wanted that. He was very clear that the house was for you. Your security. Those were his exact words. Michael wasn't part of Matthew's conspiracy because Matthew hadn't trusted him enough to recruit him. Michael knew our father too well. He would ask questions. So Matthew had simply excluded him. Now Michael knew the truth. I just expanded my witness list to 2 people. I found it on a Friday night, reading through the documents for the 100th time. Page 14. Buried in a section titled Administrative Procedures, there was a clause. Upon the administrator's determination that certain assets require specialized management, such assets may be transferred to accounts under administrative oversight, with beneficiary access limited to approved transactions only. In plain English, Matthew could take control of my money whenever he wanted and decide what I could spend it on. It wasn't permanent, technically, but there was no timeline for when this would end. There was no definition of approved transactions. It was completely open-ended. It was a legal framework for stealing. I called a lawyer the next morning. Her name was Natalie, and she specialized in financial fraud and family disputes. I sent her the documents and the voicemail from our father. This is bad, she said after reviewing everything. This is very bad. The inconsistencies alone would never hold up in court. So what do I do? Yes. Don't sign anything. Document everything your brother says from here on out. Every contradiction is evidence of fraudulent intent. I'm already doing that, I said. I hung up feeling something I hadn't felt in weeks. Clarity. I had a lawyer. I had witnesses. I had documentation. And I had proof that the documents themselves were constructed to defraud me. Matthew called me on a Wednesday evening. I want to move forward. I think you've had enough time to think about this. I've been thinking a lot, I said quietly. Good. So you're ready to sign. I wanted to ask you a few more questions first, I said, keeping my voice soft and uncertain. He sighed, but there was relief underneath it. Relief that I was complying. Relief that I wasn't going to make this difficult. Ask away, he said. What does specialized management mean? On page 14. It just means if there are circumstances that require it, I could help manage certain accounts. It's a safeguard. A safeguard against what? Against you making mistakes, he said, and I could hear the condescension. You're emotional right now. Grieving. If you made a big financial decision you'd regret, this would protect you from yourself. He wasn't even lying. He was being honest about his actual intent, to control me for my own good because in his mind I was too fragile to be trusted with my own life. I see, I said softly. That makes sense. So you're going to sign? He asked eagerly. I'm getting close. I just want to make sure I understand everything. After we hung up, I immediately sent Natalie a summary with the exact quote about protecting me from myself. She wrote back, "That's gold. That's proof of intent to control. Every word he says is damaging him." I wasn't signing anything. But Matthew didn't know that. And my calmness, my acceptance, he was interpreting it as weakness. What he didn't understand was that silence and patience were strength. I found the earlier version of the documents in my email archive. It was from Matthew, dated 8 months before. It was addressed to Caroline with the subject, "First Draft Thoughts." In this version, The management fees were explicitly 25% of quarterly earnings. The timeline for when I'd get full control was to be determined. There was a clause that would let Matthew sell Clearwater without my permission. Someone, Matthew, had taken this first draft and watered it down. He'd made the percentages vague. He'd removed the timeline entirely. He'd softened the language about the house. He'd done this because the first draft was so obviously fraudulent that even he'd realized it wouldn't work. But the revision wasn't better. It was just more carefully disguised. I sent both versions to Natalie. She called me back within an hour. It means he knew what he was doing was wrong. If this goes to court, that email is devastating. Shows premeditation. He deliberately revised it to make the illegality less obvious. 2 relatives told me the same story that Matthew had denied ever happening. The first was Raymond. I called him and said, "Do you remember when Dad was in the hospital?" "Yeah," Raymond said cautiously. "Do you remember him saying anything about Clearwater?" Raymond hesitated. "Your brother asked me not to talk about this. He said it would be confusing if everyone had different versions of what Dad said. He said it would be easier if we all stuck to one story." My heart skipped. "What story?" I asked. "That Dad wanted the assets managed together. That he wanted Matthew to handle it." "But that's not what Dad said." "No," Raymond agreed quietly. "It's not." The second person was Caroline. She pulled me aside at our mother's house. "I need to tell you something." Matthew came to me and asked if I'd remember things the way he wanted me to. He said it would be better for the family if we all had consistent memories. "Why didn't you push back?" "Because I was scared. Because I didn't want to be the reason the family fell apart." 2 people. 2 separate stories. And they matched exactly. Matthew had been actively trying to rewrite family history. This wasn't just a lie. This was organized gaslighting. I met Caroline for coffee on Monday, Michael for lunch on Tuesday, and Raymond for a walk on Wednesday. With each of them, I asked the same questions. "What do you remember about what Dad said? What has Matthew told you? Are those 2 things the same?" By the time I was done, something had shifted in their minds. They were starting to question Matthew. They were starting to doubt. On Thursday, I called a family meeting. Matthew showed up anyway because my mother mentioned it. He walked in expecting a casual gathering. Instead, he found us sitting in a semicircle, waiting. "What's going on?" he asked, and I could hear the edge in his voice. "We wanted to talk," my mother said, "about Dad's will. And what he actually wanted." Matthew's face went pale. But then Matthew smiled. He was confident, almost cocky. He clearly didn't think he'd made any mistakes. "Okay," he said, sitting down. "Let's talk about this." He began explaining how Dad wanted the assets managed carefully. How he wanted the family protected. "That's not what he said," Michael interrupted. "He said it to me privately. Before he got too sick." "No, he didn't," Michael said quietly. "I was there for most of his final conversations. He talked about her having security. About having a place that was hers." Matthew smiled, but his jaw tightened. "You remember it that way. But memories change. Especially when people are grieving." That was his play. Not to deny what had been said, but to dismiss it as unreliable memory. "How much money have you made from renting Clearwater?" I asked quietly. The room went silent. "Excuse me," Matthew said. "How much have you made from renting my house?" He stood up. "I don't appreciate this. This feels like an ambush." "Just answer the question," my mother said. Matthew looked directly at her, and for just a fraction of a second, his composure cracked. I saw panic flash across his face. And everyone in the room saw it too. "The rental income has been variable. I've covered maintenance costs, property taxes, insurance." "So you kept it all?" Michael asked. "No. Some of it was reinvested into the property." "How much was reinvested?" I asked. He didn't answer. I looked up the records. The rental income was filed in tax documents in your name, Matthew. Not in trust for me. Not in a family account. In your personal name. His face went white. I think, Caroline said slowly, you should explain that. Matthew looked around the room. He was realizing in real time that his narrative wasn't holding. Pulled out my phone. I have copies of the first version of the documents you created 8 months ago. The one with 25% management fees explicitly stated. Matthew's face drained of all color. I have copies of every text where you told people what to say. I have your email to Caroline where you asked her to remember things the way you wanted her to. I have recordings of our conversations where you contradicted yourself about Clearwater. You're recording me, Matthew said, and his voice cracked. Without my permission. That's illegal. One-party consent. It's completely legal in this state. He stood up, pacing now, his calm completely gone. I have documentation of 3 years of rental income that was never disclosed to me. I have the voicemail from Dad where he specifically talked about my security and my independence. I didn't show him the documents. I didn't play the recordings. I didn't need to. The fact that I had them was enough. Matthew left that night without another word. But the damage was done. Over the next week, relatives started calling him, asking questions, wanting explanations. Caroline told him she'd never agreed to help him rewrite family history. Michael told him that hiding rental income was basically theft. Raymond, finally processing what had actually happened, was now angry. Angry at being manipulated into supporting a lie. And my mother stopped taking his calls entirely. I didn't have to do anything. The evidence, once revealed, was doing the work on its own. Matthew called me repeatedly. We need to talk. You're twisting this. You're destroying the family. You're turning everyone against me. I was trying to help. I was trying to manage things responsibly. By lying about it. He hung up. He called back the next morning. His tone shifted from defensive to pleading to angry and back again. He was falling apart. Matthew told one final lie, thinking it would save him. He told my mother that I had been demanding money from him, that I was using the recordings and documentation as a threat, that I was trying to blackmail him. It was the opposite of everything that had happened. So backwards, so obviously false. My mother asked me directly, is this true? No. I haven't asked him for anything except an explanation. My mother asked Caroline, is this true? No. She's been honest about everything. Matthew's the one who's been lying. My mother asked Michael, is this true? Absolutely not. She's handled this with incredible maturity. By trying to paint me as a villain, Matthew had forced everyone to choose. And they all chose me. Because the evidence of his behavior was undeniable. I requested a final family meeting. I prepared everything. On a table in front of me, I laid out the documents. Both versions. The emails. The voicemail from Dad. The rental income records. I'm going to walk through this chronologically, I said, my voice steady. So everyone understands what happened. And I did. I explained how Matthew had started leasing Clearwater without asking for a specific end date. How he'd kept the rental income without disclosure. How he'd drafted documents that would give him permanent control of my finances. How he'd coordinated family members to pressure me into signing without reading carefully. How he'd tried to rewrite family memories. I explained the discrepancies in the documents. The inconsistencies in his statements. The revisions he'd made when he realized the first draft was too obviously fraudulent. I'm not angry, I said at the end. I'm sad. Because this person was my brother. And instead of being honest, he chose to manipulate me. No one said anything for a long time. Then my mother stood up and left. Not dramatically. Just left. Michael put up a hand before Matthew could speak. Don't say anything. The room turned on him in the way that only families can. Not with anger. With something colder. Disappointment. Caroline told him that she felt betrayed, that their close relationship would take years to rebuild, if it ever could. Raymond said he'd lost trust, and trust wasn't something that came back quickly. Michael told him, "Your father would be ashamed of you. He trusted you to do right by his family. And you betrayed that." Matthew tried to defend himself, tried to explain his motivations, tried to make them understand that he'd been trying to protect assets, to help, to do what was best. But none of it mattered anymore. Because the evidence was irrefutable. Because his own words, recorded, documented, and verified, betrayed him. Because he'd been caught in so many lies that nothing he said could be trusted anymore. His authority didn't evaporate. Shattered. I didn't celebrate. What I felt was something quieter, relief, and clarity. The next week, I met with Natalie, my lawyer, and we formally demanded that Matthew return the rental income from Clearwater, with interest. We demanded that he sign over the house to me completely. We demanded that he relinquish any claim to my assets. He agreed to everything. I reclaimed Clearwater. I found a tenant of my own. I opened my own account for the rental income, money that was rightfully mine. I didn't contact Matthew after that. We didn't have a reconciliation. That relationship had been built on trust, and he had destroyed it completely. So I walked away completely, not with bitterness but with certainty. I reclaimed my house. I reclaimed my finances. I reclaimed my autonomy. And most importantly, I reclaimed my right to trust my own judgment. Because the whole time Matthew was manipulating others, I had been very quietly, very calmly, building a case that could not be disputed. I had been patient. I had been observant. I had been intelligent. And in the end, patience and intelligence proved far more powerful than manipulation ever could. I never needed to raise my voice. The facts, presented calmly and completely, had done all the work. And now, walking into my own future, I knew something that Matthew would take years to learn. Silence isn't weakness. Sometimes silence is just someone gathering evidence while you keep talking. Sometimes silence is the strongest power of all.